will happen at some point soon. All right, I think it's telling me to continue. All right, so we're talking about how dire the situation is. I'm going to talk a bit about industrialized practices of food production first, to sort of start off. So obviously, at least in the United States, the vast majority of food that we consume comes from industrial practices of agriculture. And these include heavily mechanized forms of production that are generally produced in monocultures that require intensive tilling and a lot of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. This type of agriculture is really bad for the soil. It strips it of nutrients and minerals. It also kills a lot of the supporting microbes and insects that help to actually retain soil moisture and also keep the soil actually nice and fertile. And it makes the soil a lot less resilient and more prone to erosion and a variety of problems. So you can see some of the things that it does here. It's less able to retain water, so it requires a lot more irrigation. And then of course, it actually is a type of soil formation that emits rather than retains carbons and nitrous oxide. And then a lot of these nutrients aren't actually sustained in that soil either. Because it's not very well formed, a lot of this runs off into our waterways and causes dead zones and eutrophication in our waterways. Okay, so here again, talking more about some of that stuff. Global agriculture accounts for a huge proportion of the consumption of freshwater resources that we have. As we know, a lot of people lack access to good drinking water, and as the climate worsens, this is going to just become, these resources are going to become more stretched. Agriculture, in the ways in which we do it, accounts for about 30% of the global greenhouse gases that are emitted. And in the United States, it accounts for about 80% of nitrous oxide emissions and 35% of methane emissions. It also accounts for the vast majority of eutrophication that causes dead zones in the waterways that I talked about. And it's also in part largely responsible for what scientists are calling or saying is beginning to happen as the sixth mass extinction. And this is due to land use change, largely as a result of bulldozing forests and wetlands in order to create agricultural lands. And then of course, the use of agrochemicals, such as synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, also affect all the microorganisms that live in the soil. Since the World Wildlife Fund has been monitoring some 4,000 species, they have found that 68% of the vertebrate populations that they've been monitoring have been in decline. And I should say, no, that they've lost or seen a loss of 68% of the populations. So that's, I think, more clearly what they're trying to say. And then we've seen 40% of insects in decline as well. This has huge repercussions for, the food web, but also for our ability to actually even perform agriculture. So all of these problems are sort of compounding on top of each other, basically. The United Nations Food and Agricultural Association organization predicts that industrial agriculture will destroy the remaining topsoil that we have in 60 years. So as we're thinking about growing populations, increasing problems as a result of climate change, just our industrial agricultural practices as they exist now are really destructive and are going to cause us to lose our topsoils in the next 60 years. And we've already in the last 150 years lost about half of them, and about a third that we have are now degraded. So you can sort of begin seeing a little bit of the scale of the problem. So this slide is really just here to talk about the ways in which our social systems interact with our ecological systems. Because as you can see, a lot of the problems that I talked about previously on the slides have to do largely as a result of the way that we organize ourselves, our economic system and our agricultural systems, the ways that we produce and consume food. But these have repercussions for other systems as well. And I want to talk about some of the ways in which the way we organize ourselves, especially in terms of our social inequalities, how they also have environmental repercussions that we'll look at. So I'm sure you all are familiar with environmental justice research that largely looks at the ways in which environmental harms are unevenly distributed and specifically target communities of color and low-income communities as sites for locally unwanted land uses. And those are they're usually looking at things like municipal waste dumps and incinerators, but also a variety of other environmental harms. You can think about mines or chemical industries or things like that. Well, the kind of research that I've done with my colleagues when looking at environmental or looking at social inequalities and how they affect the environment, we've actually looked at it the other way around. So my colleagues and I generally look at the ways in which social inequality affects the environment, actually. And there's a huge slew of research on this, although I don't know that it has quite like a name for itself like environmental justice scholarship does. It's I think, a little bit newer type of research. But anyway, in my own research, we've seen that carbon dioxide emissions are higher per capita in nations where women have lower political status. In a recently published article, we found that in gender equal nations, there's an association, the association between GDP per capita and CO2 emissions is much lower than in nations with higher levels of gender inequality. There's been research that has shown that increased income inequality is correlated with increased water consumption, increased air pollution, and increased water pollution. There's also research that shows that racial residential segregation leads to environmental inequalities also, and lengthens car commutes and vehicle miles traveled, which worsen air and water quality overall. So basically what a lot of this research points to is that inequality not only leads to disparities in environmental exposures that disproportionately burden the disadvantaged, but also leads to higher overall levels of exposure to health damaging pollutants for everyone. So social inequality in this way is actually bad for the environment. And I want to show you some more examples of this because I think it becomes really stark when looking at some historical processes. This came from an article that was just published in Science, and I can't remember the name of it right now, but if you're interested, and I can share it later. But anyway, they were looking at the historical processes of redlining in the United States. So as many of you probably are familiar with, in the United States mid-century, last century, there was a real estate practice that engaged in actual grading of neighborhoods and graded neighborhoods based on the most desirable neighborhoods to the least desirable neighborhoods. And what they did is they actually took maps and drew lines around these neighborhoods. And you can see that the highly graded neighborhoods are in the blue and the green, and the lower graded neighborhoods are in the orange and the red. And they, through these practices, only showed Black families homes in these redlined neighborhoods. So this was a way that they created racial residential segregation and sort of maintained unequal relationships between communities. But it's a very physical manifestation of, a very material manifestation of discrimination. Well, these urban ecologists, what they did was then they looked at the urban ecology of these particular places. So they wanted to look at the ways in which these historical processes of racism and discrimination also created sort of degraded environments as well in their wake, right? So what they looked at was specifically tree canopy. I don't know if you can see this green to grayscale sort of thing here. If you'll notice, so in the green scale, the darker green colors are higher tree canopy or more vegetation. So there's a lot more biodiversity in a lot of these spaces. And on the gray scale, you can see that there's a lot less biodiversity and a lot less vegetation and tree cover. And if you'll notice in a lot of these redline neighborhoods, there's more gray and far less green than in some of these blue or green lined neighborhoods, right? So you can actually see, as a result of racial segregation and discrimination, you can actually see ecological effects of that. Here's another slide to show you some of this stuff more clearly. This comes from that same article. It's looking at structural racism and classism and how it affects urban ecologies. And I just want to look at, so some of the things they're looking at is segregation and resource allocation, things like gentrification. But what they start off by looking at on this sort of lower layer right here is impervious surface cover. When you think of impervious surface cover, for the most part, what they're talking about is concrete. So we're talking about parking lots, we're talking about major roads, highways, we're talking about industrial activity. We're primarily talking about a lot of like business, right? Or like industry, right? Or a lot of activity with regard to traffic, right? So in this more concretized area right here, you can see that there's an urban heat island effect that concentrates in that area as well, because concrete takes in a lot of heat, absorbs heat. So it causes the whole space around it to be hotter than other parts of the city. If you'll also notice, On this layer above that, they look at tree cover, right? There's a lot less trees over that urban heat island and over that impervious surface cover because there's not a lot of area for plants to grow because it's covered in concrete, right? So trees have a lot of sort of benefits, environmental benefits in this space. Not only do they act as great filters, they actually take in particulate matter and they also draw down carbon dioxide, but they also create their own microclimates. So around trees, it's usually a lot cooler. So if you don't have them, there's no way to mitigate that heat island effect, right? And you also see that in these areas, because probably there's more industrial activity, there's a lot more environmental pollutants in that space as well. And there's no vegetation there to actually take in some of that particulate matter that might be in the air. Similarly, if you're looking at some of these other social processes of resource distribution, you'll see that there are not a lot of resources in that area with the impervious surface cover. So probably the sorts of resources you might be thinking about for a residential neighborhood especially are things like grocery stores that serve nutritious and healthful food, and health clinics, someplace to go see a doctor, like actually have someplace to help you if you get sick. And then of course you can see that the disease dynamics also overlay really well with these other issues as well. Environmental pollutants, lack of trees, more urban heat islands, more impervious surface cover, right? And then similarly with the ecosystem dynamics, spaces that have more impervious surface cover are going to be less biodiverse and are more likely to have creatures that can be vectors to diseases to humans. And spaces where there is less impervious surface cover, more trees, there's going to be more biodiversity, right? You'll see a lot more life. So I know that this is looking at urban spaces, but I think it's just one example that clearly shows the mechanisms, the ways in which social inequality can actually lead to environmental degradation and how that sort of feedbacks into the harms that it causes communities and people who live in those spaces especially. And this isn't particular to urban areas either. I want to note that one of the things that I think about when I think about social inequality and I think about environmental harm, as I think about social inequality as being a way in which we distribute amenities and disamenities. And quite frankly, I think that if we were to have an equal world, we wouldn't be able to have environmental harm to the scale that we do now. So if you think about what it means to distribute amenities and disamenities, if affluent people had to actually live near the mining processes, do any of the mining themselves, and or live in their garbage, they probably wouldn't want to own as much stuff, right? So I mean, when I think about the ways in which we create inequality, part of what we're doing is we're saying some people deserve or are okay to be dumped on and to deal with the harmful effects to their environments and also to their physical health. And then some people should be buffered from that in some way. This is some way to think about how inequality and environmental harm actually work together. So I want to move on from that to also look at what the projections are for our climate, because climate change is a very complex process that's actually involved in multiple systems. So when I'm looking at this, I'm kind of looking at this overlay of a bunch of interacting systems that are working together. So thinking about the ways in which social inequalities affect environmental harm and affect climate, but also how that in turn is going to affect us as a species. So a couple of hundred countries came together in Paris in 2015 and signed the Paris Agreement. Of course, the United States is trying to pull out from that currently. In this agreement, they were talking about trying to minimize climate change at or below 2 degrees Celsius global average temperature changes. I want to talk a little bit about what that means and what it would mean to get there. So currently, right now, climate change, right, it's not something that's going to happen in the future. It's happening right now. And if 2020 seems intense to you all, I think that this is just a tiny little taste of what's to come, right? This is just the beginning of some of the badness. In 2017, we already reached a 1 degree rise in global average temperatures. I know that this doesn't sound like a lot, right? Like 1 or 2 degrees doesn't sound like a lot, but if you think about the last ice age, it was only about 4 degrees Celsius cooler than it is now. And so if you think about what it means to be 2, 3, 4 degrees hotter than it is now, it's gonna look like an entirely different planet, right? in that respect, right? So we've already reached 1 degree Celsius of global average temperature change. Actually, in 2020, they say we're about 1.1 degrees Celsius change in global average temperatures. We're on track to reach that 1.5 to 2 degrees change by mid-century. So around 2040 to 2050 is what the projections are. If we don't change anything, if we don't change our economic structure, we don't entirely get off of fossil fuels by mid-century, we're on track. So a business as usual approach, we're on track to reach about 4 degrees warming by the end of the century, or potentially I've seen other estimates of higher, like 6 or 7 degrees change in global average temperatures. So I just want to talk about what that actually means for human beings. And also I want to sort of stress the enormity of this problem. When I told my students in my Surviving the End of the World class that we needed to completely get off of fossil fuels in the next 30 years, one of my students very aptly said, 30 years to get entirely off fossil fuels? We couldn't even fix Cumberland in 10. And I was like, yeah, it's big. So you're not wrong to think about it in that way. But so it's obviously an enormous problem. And obviously this sort of problem needs to consider multiple systems that are at play. And I think social inequalities is one of the big ones, right? And not just in terms of racial inequality, gender inequality, it's all of them, right? It's capitalism as a system that organizes inequality, actually, but also in relationship to the way in which it utilizes and works in with patriarchy and white supremacy, and all of these things need to be accounted for. So again, like I said, the enormity of the problem. So I'm going to talk about what it would look like to actually get to a 4 degrees change in global average temperatures by 2100. So this is under a business as usual approach, which would mean that we're not changing anything at all, right? So 4 degrees rise in global average temperatures, the World Bank and I forget the name of this journal, it has a very long name, the Royal Proceedings of the, I can't remember, they did a special issue on 4 degrees change and what it would actually look like. And here are just some snippets of information that you might, that might be of interest to you. So everything here in the red around in the tropics would be uninhabitable by humans for the vast majority of the year. Everything north and south of it in the yellow would be inhospitable desert. So there wouldn't be any opportunity or potential for anybody to engage in any kind of agriculture at all. The vast majority of humans would have to live near the Arctic and the Antarctic, and we'd have to engage in all agriculture in these spaces as well. There would be massive oceanic dead zones. I want to point to this because this is one of the things that these articles did not talk about quite as much, which I read in a paper that came out a little bit later, that obviously because of the change in ocean acidification or ocean acidity, that's also in part related to climate change processes, especially with extensive CO2 emissions in the atmosphere. Ocean acidification and ocean temperature increases will obviously, coral reefs are actually going to be extinct probably by mid-century, but also shellfish and phytoplankton. And I want to talk about what phytoplankton do, because I'm not sure that everybody knows this. Phytoplankton produce 70% of the oxygen that exists in the atmosphere. If a phytoplankton were to die, that means that any oxygen breathing creature is likely to die too, right? So this is really important to understand. And these scientists who were talking about the phytoplankton were saying that you know, these are projections, so obviously we don't know for sure, but they were saying it's likely to happen at about a 5 degrees rise in global average temperatures. So 5 degrees is not far off from where we're projected to go towards the end of the century. So we're talking about in the next 80 years, the possibility of human extinction, actually. I don't know, this part reminds me of the Lorax a lot. I think about the ways in which they cut down all the trees, and then the capitalists cut down all the trees and then was like selling everybody oxygen. So only people who could purchase oxygen were able to survive. But that's quite literally the sort of future that we're moving towards. So I wanted to explain the enormity of the problem to talk about the ways in which we have to be creative and imagine the impossible when thinking about how to deal with some of these problems. And that not to think about it as sort of singular fixes, that we need to be more holistic in our approaches and actually consider things like social inequalities, as well as the ways in which we degrade our environments. So part of what I was trying to do with my book is look at potential alternatives. And so I want to say that I don't think that the alternatives that I'm trying to give or show are necessary. They're not prescriptive. They're just things to look at and things to consider when thinking about how we might organize ourselves differently and how we might do things differently. But I'm interested in these particular examples because they're more holistic approaches to thinking about how you might mitigate or adapt to the problems of climate change. And I also want to note that the social psychological research on these issues usually talks about the fact that people can't deal with the enormity of climate change and deal with that sort of emotionally and psychologically. And that what they need in order to be able to process some of this stuff is that they need examples of alternatives. So that's kind of part of the work that I'm trying to do. I'm trying to think about and talk about and possibly evaluate alternative ways of being to sort of assess or see what would be viable, what people are interested in. It's also a way in which you can sort of pick certain aspects that would be useful or maybe not useful to you. But I want to do a visioning exercise, and during the question and answer session, if you want to talk about some of the things that you envision through this, we can talk about it then, but we don't have a lot of time for sort of like back and forth right now, which is too bad. But this comes from the preface of my book. So imagine the year is 2050. Everything has improved. The global community does better than meeting the Paris Agreement targets and limits global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. All nations transition away from fossil fuels and meet carbon neutral and negative goals. A climate migrant program successfully relocates people to permanent homes abroad. Poverty has been eradicated globally and everyone is able to comfortably meet their needs. All people can expect quality care and a voice in matters that affect their lives, regardless of ability, age, gender, race, religion, or sexuality. Global indicators of health and happiness are high. Conflict, violence, and war are on the decline everywhere. You yourself, regardless of age, are happy, healthy, and are surrounded by a loving and supportive community. How did we get here? I challenge people to be bold and creative and to really imagine the impossible. What does it take for the world to be in this great state? And this is something that I also challenge people to be specific. What does the economy look like? What are local communities doing? How are their economies shaped? Are they beholden to global markets? How has agriculture changed? How have ecosystems and indigenous ways of knowing been protected? How is community organized? How do you make decisions? Is everyone involved? And is everyone's input valued equally? So these are just some of the questions that I've been thinking through. And so I have been interested in ways of doing things, in approaches that are very different to the approaches that we know to be the more hegemonic forms of ways of doing things that we do things now. So one of the communities that I studied or I looked at was an urban eco-village. And the way they designed their village was around this sort of philosophy and way of doing agriculture and community building at the same time. So permaculture actually has a social and ecologically integrated mission. Just to give you a definition, it's consciously designed landscapes which mimic the patterns and relationships found in nature while yielding an abundance of food, fiber, and energy for provision of local needs. And it incorporates the ways in which communities are designed as well, right? People, their buildings, and the way that they organize themselves are central to permaculture. Thus, the permaculture vision of permanent sustainable agriculture has evolved to one of permanent sustainable culture. So it's a more holistic sort of systems thinking way of dealing with social and environmental problems. So I just want to give you some visuals to think about how you might socially and ecologically integrate things together. Here is a top view of the eco-village. You can see this purple line is the perimeter. Most of the housing is situated around the perimeter. So this is actually where people live. So this design is meant to have like a central meeting space so that people can come together and work together on various projects and also just enjoy each other and spend time together, right? Here is the garden where a lot of people grow their own food, and you can see this is another view of the garden. You can see this is a very diverse, a biodiverse space. There are a variety of different plants that are being grown here. They also purposely leave some of this middle space right here, which is actually this space right here. This is a sort of workshop area. There's a wood shop there. This is also a space where people come together to do things like talk about permaculture and teach classes on it, so that people in the community who are interested can learn more about how to engage in these kind of practices. So education is a very important part or an important component of the work that they do in this space. They also purposely leave space open for people to be able to gather and hang out. And of course, things in the area are designed with the ecosystem in mind, such that they have rainwater in catchment barrels in different places, and they've designed the area in general. So all the trees around here are actually fruit trees, so that people can actually eat things while they're walking around in the area as well. So some of the ways that they attend to some of the more social aspects of relating to each other, more egalitarian relationships. They practice consensus decision-making. They actually hold monthly or bi-monthly meetings where people come together and make decisions about the property. They also engage in these more, I want to say, psychological or dynamic or like interrelationship kinds of things together as well. They engage in these processes called co-counseling and nonviolent communication, which I'll explain a little bit here as well. Co-counseling is sort of like similar-ish in idea to having like a support group, but it's not necessarily the same thing. It's not the same as we understand a support group, but it's a way for people to deal with trauma and to try to grow and to get past some of that trauma. Another thing they engage in, like I said, was nonviolent communication. Nonviolent communication is a form of communication that centers compassion in communication. So when you're talking to somebody, you are practicing active listening. So very much remaining silent and letting somebody fully complete their thought. And while they're doing that, providing feedback about what you think that you hear they're saying, but also from a space of compassion to say, I can see that this really is upsetting to you. And so it's an active form of listening, and actually a very difficult practice. I've tried it, it's not easy. They also engage in a lot of sharing, and education, like I said, was another huge component of this. So the spaces, they actually consider it somewhat of an educational space for people who live within the community and also for people who live outside of the community. The permaculture principles are actually principles that a lot of people say they live their life by, which are caring for the earth, caring for the people, and sharing the surplus. A lot of sharing takes the form of community potlucks, but also people just sharing whatever comes from their garden spaces or whatever they've been able to glean from the neighborhood around them. So these are some of the ways in which the eco-villagers do some of that work to try to be more socially egalitarian and relate in these ways, but also to work with and relate to the ecosystem differently. So the next case that I'm going to talk about is the case of the urban farm in Havana, Cuba. They practice agroecology, which I want to say actually agroecology is a very similar form of agriculture to permaculture. They both engage a lot of local and traditional knowledge, actually. And it's somewhat appropriation in some senses, but not entirely in other senses, I think. In agroecology, just to give you a sense of what it is, it's the study of ecological processes applied to agriculture. So it's bringing ecological principles to bear in agroecosystems. The term may refer to a science, the movement, or a practice. Agroecology is scientifically studied. Actually, Miguel Altieri in the UC system has been doing a lot of work on agroecology for quite a long time. They're really looking at interconnections in nature to promote the health of all the living and all the microorganisms that live in the area, but other creatures as well. They focus a lot on trying to conserve biodiversity, but on seed freedom, right? So this would be an alternative approach to thinking about the ways in which Monsanto, say, as an example, is trying to genetically modified seeds such that we have drought-resistant seeds. Well, they're saying, well, we can do other things. We can allow seed freedom and at the same time have healthier soils that retain more water so that we don't have to worry as much about drought-resistant seeds, right? And they prioritize local knowledge and local understandings of the ecosystems and the ecology. So the farm in Havana that I stayed at, it sort of resembled a closed loop system, though it's not entirely closed. So I want to speak to the fact that it's not entirely the case. But you can see here some of the ways in which they are trying to do this. So I'm starting in this very left corner looking at that fallow field. So it's a field left fallow. They have oxen who would eat from the field, but also help with some of the plowing. They use the manure from the oxen. These are actually piles of manure and compost that are set out to get in some sun before they end up over here at the vermiculture station, where they have worms who will eat the manure and create a very highly nutritious worm humus that they then apply to the starter plants that are here in this nursery. And then once the plants get big enough, they'll take them out to the field and actually plant them. And they have somebody on site who is very knowledgeable about the ways in which insect populations relate to each other. And part of her job is to literally go around the fields and watch the insects on the various plants to see what kinds of insects are there. And if she notices anything like a huge proportion of pest insects in relationship to other more beneficial insects, she'll actually go pull insects from somewhere else that might eat those other insects and actually bring them to this other place to do some biological pest control in that way. They utilize other forms of biological pest control, or I should say management, and also they don't really like the term pest, but I don't really know what else to call them. They're the bugs that eat the plants that are not very useful for the crops that they're trying to grow. So other forms of biological pest control or management that they do is they utilize a system of push-pull plants, that what they'll do. So as an example, a pull system would be a system in which you have cereal crops and that might be affected by these stem borer creatures. And what they'll do is plant grasses around the cereal plants that attract these stem borers to them. And then the grasses are so thick, they kind of trap the stem borers there as well. So the cereal crop is able to grow and the grasses take the pests for the cereal plants. There are other examples of this as well. The push system is a system in which they'll intercrop things like marigolds that have a particular repellent scent to a lot of insects. They don't want to be around it, so they just move on out of there because they're not interested in being there. And then from there, the crops that are harvested are then taken out to the farm right at the edge of the farm, right on the street, right next to the neighborhood that's right next door, has a vending facility where they actually sell the crops. And they also sell these sort of value-added items for crops that perhaps were not necessarily don't look in as good a shape to be sold. They'll actually make things like tomato paste or pickles out of them, things like that. And then of course their economic office is extremely important because this is how they, they deal with the money that they get from this whole process, and they're able to reinvest in their production processes as well. So in terms of their social relationships, they are a cooperative, so they have cooperative ownership of the property. They engage in not necessarily consensus decision making, but a more direct form of democracy. Everybody has a vote in things that happen there. People are able to become cooperative members after they've been voted in. So they usually work there for like 1 or 2 months as like a probationary period. And then at the end of that time, people vote on whether or not they can stay and become a cooperative member. And their income is based on length of employment, not on the type of sector that they work in. So in this way, they're actually showing people that their value is not based on what they do necessarily, but how long they've contributed. So all sectors are pretty equally valued. There are a lot of benefits to regenerative agriculture. As I mentioned before, it retains water, moisture, it requires less irrigation, it loses a lot less water. It also retains and stores and can even sequester carbon dioxide. And these regenerative agriculture is also really great for biodiversity. It increases biodiversity of the soils, which is really important to have healthy soils, to have lots of microorganisms and insects that actually help to do things like fix nitrogen that are necessary for the crops that are being grown. Healthy soils experience a lot less erosion. They're more resilient in the face of floods and droughts, which are going to become more and more common as the climate changes. And healthy soils are very nutrient dense and produce much higher yields. There are obvious human benefits to these kinds of designs as well. Interspecies relationships, exposure to green space, all of these things and social interaction have been all correlated with reduced blood pressure, stress, better mental health, decreases in inflammation, increases in life expectancy. So you can see that all of these things are actually beneficial to the people who are involved in them as well. So I guess some of the takeaways, obviously these different cases are interested in their economies to a degree, but they really, sort of the primary focus is really on how the ecological and social systems are relating to each other, and the economy sort of stems from that, rather than what I think the way we do it now is we actually focus on the economy and think about how we can do things to benefit the economy rather than benefiting the ecology and the people involved as well. They're very elegant low-tech designs that focus on local ecosystems, very interested in the processes of the local ecosystems. And so they are based a lot in more traditional and indigenous knowledges. They integrate democratic community participation and collaboration, but also emphasize care networks as an important part of this. They do a lot of sharing and caring for each other. And again, like I said, they're not prescriptive. They're just some examples. Because I think that examples help people in the creative process and also when thinking about and trying to envision alternative futures, especially considering we're talking about what's at stake is the survival of our species. So I think it's time for us to get creative. Anyway, that's what I got for you today. I did more than 35 minutes, I know. Sorry.
Okay, that was great. So we can jump in with questions. Like I said, you can put them in the chat, and I'll try to moderate. Or last time I think it worked fairly well by people just kind of jumping in where they can. Yeah, there we can see people a little bit better. Questions?
Okay. Can I jump in? I have a question. Thank you, Christina. That was a really awesome talk. So I have a few questions, but I'm gonna limit it to 2. So first, it was great how you were talking about how any existing inequalities create environmental problems. But corporations obviously already know this, and this is a really easy way for them to tap into discourses of we're helping people. We're feeding the world, right? This is one of the really big ways that they claim to feed the world by spreading industrial agriculture to feed a growing population. But we already have enough food to feed everyone right now. We just need to stop throwing it away. How do we how do we address that? How often our own efforts are used against us by corporations in order to kind of greenwash their own presence?
Wow, Sarah, that's a hard question. I am very familiar with corporate co-optation. It's a very huge frustration of mine. I guess one of the things that I think about with regard to the food situation specifically is sort of the irony in it. There's enough food. We make enough food right now to feed 10 billion people. We already can feed the growing populations that exist. The problem isn't a problem of the ability to do so, it's a distribution problem. And it's not just a distribution problem, but it's also a problem of the fact that a lot of the land is being used to grow things that aren't even for people's food consumption. They're for biofuels, and they're for feeding cows or feeding chickens and things like that. So how to keep them from co-opting the message? I don't know how to answer that question. It was funny because I had Richard York come and speak to my class right before this, and the main thing that he keeps pointing to, and I guess this is a sociological point in general, I think a lot of people point to this, we need real power struggle. This is an issue of power. And that I think means in large part active social movements. But in terms of how to keep them from co-opting the message, I mean, I think that's I don't know, that's a power issue.
Yeah, I don't know how to answer the question either. I was just gonna see what you had to, if you've learned anything in your struggles and seen how people respond to it. But in relation to that, my follow-up question, I was gonna use another question, but this one actually makes more sense. Did any of your students talk about violence when they were talking about how they get to the solutions?
You know, it was sad because that class ended a little too abruptly due to the pandemic, which also a little too on the nose. So we actually didn't talk about the use of violence, so no, we didn't talk about it. Are you asking me if I'm promoting violence?
No, I was gonna say, like, I'm actually, like, I know for a fact that the powerful are not going to hand over their power very nicely. So, like, there are going to be struggles, and people have to think through that, right? Like, especially because of the use of the police. Like, that is a really big issue we're seeing against protesters. So that's more in line with what I was